I would argue that you can never anticipate something like this.
But the truth of the matter is, you have to be who you are. And I made mistakes in that I didn't go with my gut instinct and the feel. And I know Nick better than, some expert who's never met him. And I think had I listened to my own instincts, I would have done a lot better by Nick. You want to keep him safe.
But how do you keep them safe from themselves? How do you save them from themselves?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. That's a quote by Viktor Frankl. I would argue that you can anticipate. Just by looking at pictures of Nick, we can see that he wasn't in a happy place, and unhappy drug addicts are dangerous, either dangerous to themselves or to others or both. Unhappy drug addicts are unhappy because their lives lack purpose. They are increasingly overwhelmed by existential emptiness, and they try to numb this. But you can't numb existential emptiness. You can only fill it with meaning. If you don't know what's meaningful, or you do, but you can't do anything meaningful, you can't get yourself to a place to find that or to do that, well, then you have a problem. Then distraction from that problem is your only option. But it's an option that's going to make that lack of purpose even worse. We also know that drug addiction basically escalates, and that escalation can be measured. A person loses weight, they start stealing, they start having run-ins with the law, everything is getting worse and worse. And we saw this with 34-year-old Victoria Jones, just 2 years older than Nick Reiner. Victoria Jones is Tommy Lee Jones's daughter. Like Nick, Victoria also sort of lived in her famous father's shadow. Like Nick, Victoria also appeared in a movie with her more famous father. That movie happened to be Men in Black 2. And like Nick, Victoria seemed to struggle to develop her own identity. Now, I'm not sure if the best way to develop your identity, if your father's been in the movies, is to try to be in the movies yourself. Maybe you need to try to find something that is completely different to that. But what if you can't let go of that? What if you feel you want to use some of that legacy? Why not trade on some of that legacy? Well, according to Radar, Victoria, who appeared on screen alongside her father as a child, once showed early promise, just like Nick. She had charisma, she had brains, but drugs and anger, look at those words, anger toward her family, took that from her. It's a tragedy that no one should have to endure, according to a former co-worker. Now, I do think the lure of fame and wealth and celebrity, if a relative has it, has got to be pretty painful if one pursues it and it eludes you. It probably feels like lifelong rejection, which, I mean, it sort of is. It probably feels like preferential treatment, which, well, it sort of is. According to Radar, Victoria was found unresponsive on New Year's Day at a luxury San Francisco hotel. Friends say the tragedy, while devastating, followed years of mounting concern that Victoria's escalating struggles with addiction and anger could end in catastrophe. And what you see there is there's anger there, and how can one deal with or diffuse that anger? You can also see that there was mounting concern and escalating struggles. So how can you not predict that there's going to be a disaster at the end of all of this? Drug addiction doesn't end happily ever after if it's heading in the direction of escalation. There cannot be a happy ending. So we've got to ask the question, what anger issues was Victoria dealing with? And that's an important question because probably, they were the same anger issues Nick was dealing with, because it's a very similar situation. And look at the answer. Anger towards her parents. So much so her friends feared she might become another Nick Reiner. But let's get back to the actual Nick Reiner. And more to the point, what made Nick, the middle child, different to Jake and Romy? And I guess implicit in that question is another question. What makes one person a drug addict and another person not a drug addict? And I would say the difference lies in self-esteem issues. Nick's was lower than Jake's and Romy's. Do you agree with that? And I think some of his own decision-making, his own choices, made it even lower still. So in other words, you can have a situation that then aggravates itself through bad decision-making. And I think one way that a drug addict can maybe get out of their addiction or get out of their situation is to consciously ask themselves, is this decision I'm making going to lower or improve my self-esteem? If I don't do this, is that going to build my self-esteem? If I do this, where's that going to take me? Now, personally, I would say Jake seems a lot more motivated and inner directed than his younger brother. Romy as well, perhaps less so than Jake, but still more than Nick. Certainly by age 32, Nick appears also to be the least attractive of the three siblings. And let's face it, in Hollywood, appearances matter. What you look like matters. And I mean, look at him in this photo. Look at how he's dressed. Look at his face. He just seems to exude defeat and resignation. And I would say Nick's self-esteem was somehow in poorer shape all along compared to Jake's and Romy's. That's not a fact, it's a hunch. And of course, once you're in the hole of low self-esteem, it's easier to get relief from it than do the hard work of building it up again. And what did we say at the beginning? When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, and a lot of us do find that meaning through our self-esteem, through the perspective of self-esteem. But if you can't find it, when people can't find a deep sense of meaning, when they can't find their self-esteem, they distract themselves with pleasure. And that pleasure is not always drugs. It might be comfort eating. And of course, each time you seek relief, you end up on that slippery slope where one day you're going to wake up and be totally empty, totally washed up, totally broken. But the solution is quite simple. Find something to do. Don't do something you can't keep up. Don't have some lofty goal that you end up not being able to handle and then you back to square one. Do something that you can be consistent at, even if it's jogging a few miles each day or walking your dog or keeping a diary. There are 4 stages of addiction: experimentation, regular use, risky use, and addiction. You can see that that is moving in a particular direction. Whether you move along that spectrum, how much you move, and how fast you move has a lot to do with self-discipline. And self-discipline is often something that comes out of self-esteem. Self-esteem in turn is derived from one's sense of identity, or indeed a lack of. And so if you don't have self-esteem, it probably means you have no sense of your own identity. And if you don't have a sense of identity, well, maybe you should start thinking about getting one. And how do you get one? Well, you find out what you are interested in besides drug addiction. You find out what you like. You start doing things that are of interest to you and perhaps that you are good at. In real life, reality, though, can be a bummer. The temptation is always there to feel good, to take the path of least resistance, to get instant gratification, and using an outward stimulus. And that is much harder than getting that sense of, I don't want to call it gratification, but that sense of self from the inside, from what comes inside of you. And if you think of sport as a stimulus where you are doing something that is inner directed, well, you end up feeling bad. You feel tired, you feel hot and sweaty, you feel exhausted, you feel pain, you feel discomfort. But at the other side of that is a sense of well-being and feeling healthy and feeling good and looking good. But you need to then be able to delay gratification. And in the real world, typically things that involve delaying gratification are routes to self-esteem. So anything that makes you feel good very quickly is probably something that's not good for your self-esteem or your identity. I think some people are more prone to addiction in the same way that some people are more prone to taking risks or participating in extreme sports. My personal feeling is that a strong protector against drug addiction is good self-esteem, as well as a healthy lifestyle. I know I always hated the idea of pulling smoke into my lungs because I was a top swimmer and triathlete. It just seemed dumb and not particularly cool. The thing is, to some, taking drugs is cool. It's edgy. It's what high society apparently do. It shows that you are special. Well, not really. I think even high society looks at it and regards it as weak and pathetic, if not ill-advised. Johann gave a TED talk where he introduced a novel concept, a rat park, where the two options that the rats had were water, ordinary water, and then water laced with drugs. And in this setting, the rats chose the drug-laced water and got instantly addicted and basically drank themselves to death. But then they did another experiment where they filled the rat park with all sorts of interesting distractions and hamster wheels and things to amuse themselves and to get exercise. Overall, this was a far more stimulating environment, and in this environment, none of the rats became addicted. And the lessons seem to be simple. Keep yourself occupied with healthy pursuits and you'll be fine. Socialize and have the appropriate balance of boundaries and entertainment and you'll do fine. But get bored, or worse, start to feel shitty about yourself, and, well, there's a recipe for stage 1 of drug addiction, which is experimentation. Now, this is a fascinating theory, and there are also some interesting caveats, which you'll see in the comments. I'll post a link to this particular video it comes from X, but I'll post it in the description. One chap, Jeremy McCarthy, says, I've met plenty of people who have a deep social network and are still addicts. People who literally lost all family, friends, and a job over addiction. The answer is not this easy. Someone else commented, the experiment doesn't relate to the realities of addiction. When someone is addicted, despite all the people around them, their addiction is in control. Now, I do think one thing that often leads to addiction is someone becoming reclusive. And I'm not sure which one happens first, the addiction or the reclusiveness, but certainly it's easier to hide an addiction away if you're starting to be isolated. And so I think if you're talking about addiction and who or what is in control, I think it depends on the stage of the addiction. There's a point where the would-be addict is in control and then he gradually gives up that control. And there's a point where the substance is more in control, and then it's really up to the people around the addict to make sure that they go to rehab, that they, even if it's kicking and screaming if necessary, to get clean. The fact that Nick somehow managed to convince his parents to stop sending him to rehab, I think led to a soft approach which ended up as a possible worst case scenario. Same with Victoria. One might say drug addicts aren't violent, well, until they are. In criminality, there's a sort of continuum. It starts with lies, then stealing, and sometimes killing. I would say violent or aggressive behavior is not a matter of if when it comes to drug addicts, but when. And if you are at the when stage, if there has been some violent or aggressive behavior, it's not a question whether one needs to take action. It is absolutely crucial. Now, although I think it's reductionist to look at the rat scenario and apply it wholesale to Nick Reiner or to any drug addict for that matter, I don't think one can entirely dismiss the experiment either. It has some value, but it's not a cure-all either. Someone left a comment saying, this is what non-drug addicts think reality is for drug addicts, and I think that speaks volumes. Another said, drug addicts also bond over drugs, as we see in the movie Trainspotting. I want to end off by addressing this whole idea that it's not something we can anticipate, what happened with Nick Reiner. And we can see that via, I think, the answer through Tommy Lee Jones' daughter. She died of an overdose in the corridor of a hotel recently. According to Radar, we were all terrified she was headed for disaster and could potentially hurt someone she loved, a longtime friend revealed. So that we were all terrified, that was before all of this happened. Victoria had a history with substances. She was brilliant one minute, then the addiction would take over. Her rage towards her parents was intense. Nothing seemed to reach her, and it made all of us worry. Court records show Victoria's struggles had increasingly spilled into public view. In 2025 alone, she was arrested 3 times, including incidents in Napa and Santa Cruz involving allegations of drug possession, DUI, and this is important, domestic battery, and elder abuse. We also know that the cops were called to the Reiner residence on numerous occasions. Each of these incidents where police needed to be summoned is a massive red flag, no different from calls that Nicole Brown Simpson made before she lost her life. And so, back to Victoria, she kept getting into trouble, and every time her parents would rescue her, but the pull of addiction is merciless. So I do think there is a predictable pattern of escalation, and I think if you don't take serious measures such as rehab and that very painful process, then the results unfortunately are also all too predictable. Catastrophe. As I say, serious drug addiction, there are no happily ever afters if you just leave it to go its natural course. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I have posted a post on Kohberger's sister, Breaking Her Silence, on Patreon. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. So go and have a gander at that on Patreon. It's patreon.com/TCRS. Meanwhile, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.